Well, welcome to a new book of the study of the Bible. For those who have been here before, we've been making a long, dedicated study through the book of Job. So today we are going to be making a dedicated study through the book of Esther. It's not as long. Exactly. So we have some fewer chapters to cover, but hopefully you will glean just as much as you did out of the book of Job. For those who've been in my studies before, you'll know one of the things that I do, especially that first study, I don't spend as much time giving you all the background before we even begin reading in the book. We just start reading the book, and then as the verses open up to the context, then we spend time in the context. So we'll get there today, but we're going to do it through the beginning scriptures. Just so y'all know, there are a lot of reasons that people choose not to study the book of Esther. For one thing, it is one of the Old Testament books that's named after a woman. Believe it or not, that's a problem for some people, and they don't want to study the book. It is one of two Old Testament books that does not mention God directly. So there is no mention of God in the book of Esther in a direct fashion. The other one is the book of the Song of Solomon. It is one of two books of the Bible that details specifically the persecution of the Jewish people. The other book would be the book of Exodus. So those two books, just their primary, they mention and they detail the persecution of the Jews. Esther is the only Old Testament book in which the entire narrative of the book takes place in Persia. So there's no part of it that takes place in Palestine or Israel or any of that geography. There is nothing quoted or referred to in the New Testament from the book of Esther. So most all the other Old Testament books, when you're doing your reading through the New Testament, you will find quotes, or not maybe direct quotes, but you can tell from the context or the word choices that it's supposed to be a quote from an author or a prophet from the Old Testament. Esther is the only book that was not found in the recovered Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. So this discovery was made in 1947, where there was a full copy or a section of every Old Testament book that was found there except the book of Esther. So it's excluded for some reason. So Esther also contains the account of the origin of the Feast of Purim. It is one of the two festivals that are celebrated in the Jewish community that's not found in the Mosaic Law, the other being Hanukkah. So those two are celebrations in the Jewish community that are not found in the Mosaic Law. And so Esther is the book in which that feast is celebrated, and we'll get into a lot more detail of that as we get towards the end of the book. Hanukkah and Purim. P-U-R-I-U-M. There appear to be some moral and ethical decisions by the Jewish characters of the story that seem difficult to justify. And we will discuss those as we cross them in our verse by verse study of the book. So, with this impressive list of all the reasons people choose not to study the book of Esther, why would we take an interest in studying such a book? Well, I would contend, first of all, that the Council of Hippo in AD 393 and the Council of Carthage in 397 both included Esther in the canon. So the fact that God not only is the author of the entire book, that he obviously can serve as a really good editor, he decided to make sure that it was included in the works. And so I think it's important that we study it. So it was preserved by God in his word, and we can trust that he will direct us there, and there is something for us in the scriptures. All scriptures are given to us for specific reasons, and we get a confirmation of that in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 and 17. So 2 Timothy chapter 3, 16 and 17. All scriptures inspired by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, so that the man of God may be adequate, equipped for every good work. So we can conclude that Esther will meet these same standards and provide this kind of encouragement for believers. So, with that being said, let's now step into Esther and we'll do chapter 1. We'll begin with verses 1 through 8. Now, it took place in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, as King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which was at the citadel in Susa, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his princes and attendants, the army officers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of his provinces being in his presence. And he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180 days. When these days were completed, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days for all the people who were present at the citadel in Susa, from the greatest to the least, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were hangings of fine white and violet linen held by cords of fine purple linen on silver rings and marble columns, and couches of pure gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyria, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels of various kinds, and the royal wine was plentiful according to the king's bounty. The drinking was done according to the law. There was no compulsion. For so the king had given orders to each official of his household that he should do according to the desires of each person. All right, so we begin back in verse 1, and verse 1 reveals when the story took place in history by identifying it took place in the days of Ahasuerus. And this is the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. So this was a ruler of an expansive kingdom geographically, with the detail of it extending all the way from India to Ethiopia. This was a ruler, the Persian name is Shirija. It was translated Ahasuerus in the Hebrew. In the Greek, it is translated as Xerxes. I don't know about you all, but it can be very difficult for me if one person can't just keep the same name when I'm trying to do research. So I share that with you so that if you do some research, if you want to get more into the history, you'll know that there's different cultures that have referred to this particular person by different names. So don't let that be a confusion. It is important to know that this ruler can be referred to by those names. How this man became king and what the circumstances were surrounding his transition to power historically are important to understand what is revealed next in the narrative of Esther. So the book of Esther doesn't give us all the background. We go outside the Bible for some of that historical background. So Ahasuerus was the son of Darius the first of Persia, who was son of Hapstis and Otasha, daughter of Cyrus the Great. So Darius the First, also known as Darius the Great, ruled from 521 to 486 BC for about 36 years. Darius the First had selected Ahasuerus as his heir before preparations were made for a journey he was planning on taking. This was the expectation of rulers at that time in the Medo-Persian kingdoms. He was to leave in 487 to 486 BC, but his failing health prevented him from leaving, and he died in 486 BC. So Ahasuerus was crowned in late 486 BC, and he was about 36 years old. All of that's important because we need to know the background of what occurs as this man enters into being a king. So, knowing about his father, King Darius I had established his kingdom and expanded his kingdom through marriage alliances, great building projects, and military dominance. So that's the man that had been the king prior to Ahasuerus. He separated the kingdom into provinces and he assigned governors to oversee them. So this was his structure that he used in overseeing and being the administrator of such a large kingdom. He had established Aramaic as the official language in his kingdom. He had introduced a single monetary system, and he had connected the kingdom by building an intertwining road system. That's amazing in that time period, considering how large this kingdom was. In biblical importance, King Darius I supported rebuilding the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. We get that when we look to the book of Ezra. In Ezra chapter 6, verses 14 and 15. So Ezra 6, 14 and 15. And the elders of the Jews were successful in building through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. And they finished building according to the command of the God of Israel and the decree of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. This temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month, Adar. It was the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. So the decree to allow the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, which had been initiated by Cyrus the Great, it was again acknowledged to be enforced during the reign of Darius the First. So the temple was completed during the reign of Darius the First. So it's standing in Jerusalem as we're in the book of Esther. From the scriptural reference, the notable king missing in this chronology would be King Ahasuerus, right? So we had Cyrus the Great who signed. We have Darius who's in power, and we know that the temple was completed. And then we hear about Artaxerxes, which is Ahasuerus' son. So there's this gap of a king that's not mentioned in terms of relationship to this decree that was signed. But the building continued, and we get a lot more detail in the history books when Artaxerxes is king, where the walls are completed and the city is continuing to be built. And you can read about that in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. So the events recorded in Ezra and Nehemiah are events that took place while this man's son was the king of the kingdom. But the book of Esther provides us with the importance of King Ahasuerus to the Jews. Even though he's not listed in that list in terms of the decree that had been signed or the building, doesn't mean that God wasn't using this king and wasn't using him specifically in regards to his people. And that's what the entire book of Esther unfolds for us. In verse 2 of Esther, it establishes that there was a royal throne to be at the citadel of Susa. So the capital city of Elam was Susa, and it had been rebuilt by Darius the First as one of his capital cities, right? So they had multiple capital cities that they could move around to that were fortified and a place in which everything of convenience was there for the king, protection, folks from the kingdom could gather. And if you think about it, that would be wise for a lot of reasons. First of all, if you're a king, you might want to be in a warmer climate when it's cold somewhere. But more importantly than that, for this vast kingdom, it would be easier for the king to move around and then have individuals come and sit in court with him and discuss things than to expect everybody all over the kingdom always to move. But that is what we see happening in the book of Esther. But just for a note, it wasn't like, when we established the capital of a state, it just stays and that's the only one. In this large kingdom, there were several cities that could be utilized as their capital. So the capital wasn't the city name, it was where the king resided. Wherever the king resided, that city was now the capital because that's where the decisions were being made. In verse 3, the narrative begins in the 3rd year of his reign. It is critical to understand the history of what preceded Ahasuerus' ascension to the throne and what transpired during the initial transition of power. This is important understanding in what takes place in the 1st year of his reign and how it influences what is revealed to us in the book of Esther. King Ahasuerus had dealt with revolts from two major powers that had been going on years before he ascended to the throne, and that would have been in Egypt and in Babylon. Those were not the only revolts. We are talking about a massive land area. There would have been minor revolts, but the two large ones that are identified in history occurred in Egypt and in Babylon. Many historians agree that the taxation to do all of the building projects and the military campaigns that took place under Darius I was a major reason for these uprisings. The appointment of Ahasuerus to succeed Darius I was not welcome in many parts of the kingdom because he was seen as the one who would continue to rule as his father had. And there were many who wanted a change of leadership style to be a less domineering and aggressive, expansive man. Just to say here, there's a whole lot of history here. You are free to go out and do all the research of history that you desire. This is the briefest overview that I could put together, but there's a lot of very interesting detail if you're a history buff. Like other sons that would have been like firstborn sons, how come they were passed over so that Ahasuerus was the one that was recommended to be the heir to the throne? Why did that happen? You know, if you can only imagine in the families that you know, if the eldest is passed over for somebody else, that might create hard feelings. And in that day, those hard feelings wouldn't be kept at the Christmas reunion, right? These would be feelings that would be carried out because there would be those that had loyalty to the oldest son or to the second son or fill in the blank. This is why the revolts were taking place. After putting an end to the revolt in Egypt, he appointed his brother Achaemenes as governor, or as referred to in the scriptures as a satrap. So he took his brother, after the revolt was put down, he says, you be in charge, you make sure that you keep an eye on what's going on, you protect the main kingdom from there being uprising or men taking liberties. During the same time, he had to deal with the revolt ongoing in Babylon. So this is a man who must be able to multitask. There's not one thing happening in one place. There's a lot of things going on. The one in Babylon has just a little bit of an interesting twist to it. So in Babylon, there was a custom that one would accept that they were king over Babylon, where they would go on New Year's Day to this statue. So if the rightful king would show up in Babylon and go to this particular statue and clasp the hands of the statue of Bel, this would have been a sign of acceptance of power from the worshipped entity. So that's the way it was supposed to work. You're the king, you show up in Babylon, and in Babylon on New Year's Day, you go to the statue, you clasp the hands, and now we are seen as the king because we've clasped his hands, and now that god or that statue that represents a god acknowledges you as the king over Babylon. Isn't it just fun, all the stuff that went on? Imagine, if you would, that the president of the United States had to travel to every state and do something that that state required the president to do in order to be acknowledged as the president of the United States. That's kind of what was going on here. So Ahasuerus defied this tradition. And instead, he captured their gold statue and he had it melted down. You can see why there may have been a revolt in Babylon. This prevented anyone else from practicing this tradition and subsequently challenging his rule as the king of Babylon. But this infuriated those of influence in Babylon, especially those who had gained their power through the religious worship of Baal. So you see how it's all connected. And Ahasuerus came along and said, no, not going there and not doing that. As a matter of fact, we're going to take your statue, we're just going to melt it down. so that it can't have that representation anymore. Well, for those who made their living off of the power, right? Because there's a little bit of power when you got to come to my God and hold his hand, and then I get to decide who's invited to see it, right? There's all kinds of intrigue that goes with that. So needless to say, he created quite an uprising because the elite of Babylon were not happy. So they didn't like this guy. They didn't like what he just did. So we have a huge uprising that had to be put down. He also, this would be Ahasuerus, did not recognize the title of king of Babylon, but instead he was the king of Persia and Midian. In other words, king of all. And he did not need to add king of any of the regions that he was over. This was a significant insult to the subjects of Babylon. So this contributed to the revolts that happened in both 484 BC and 482. This is a very simplified description of what took place in the transition of Ahasuerus to leadership from his father Darius I in regards to these two specific revolts. So again, each of these you can go read all kinds of detail in history and get a lot more information. One of the areas of immediate concern that were to be handled, Ahasuerus focused his attention on an unresolved issue with the Greeks. Ionia had begun a revolt during the rule of his father Darius I and sought support from the Greeks, which the Greeks were more than happy to provide. Working together, they burned the city of Sardis, but then had to retreat, suffering heavy losses. So this attack on Sardis could not go unpunished by Darius I, and he swore to punish the offenders by burning down their capital cities of Athens and Eurydia. This also encouraged Darius I to decide to subjugate the Greeks and add them to his vast kingdom. So this attempt ended in what was known as the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. The Greeks were victorious in defeating the Persian advances. All the intrigue is building. This is all important as we're going to finish these verses in Esther chapter 1. Darius I took several years in preparation for his next attempt to deal with the Greeks and to carry out his intentions of burning down Athens and Eurydia. However, he died before he could finish the endeavor. So, as Ahasuerus was dealing with the uprisings of Egypt and Babylon, he was also preparing to finish what his father had intended to do against the Greeks. Remember, he's multitasking. The ancient historian Herodotus recorded that Ahasuerus continued the preparations begun by Darius I for another 4 years after he became the king. For those that don't know, Herodias, and I put a quote from him. What he says is for full 4 years after the conquest of Egypt, he was equipping his force and preparing all that was needed for it. Before the 5th year was completed, he set forth on his march with the might of a great multitude. So we get the detail of how long this gathering took place of the military and the support for the military before the launching of the attack took place. That's what brings us back to the book of Esther. We are 3 years into Ahasuerus' ascension to the throne, according to Esther, which would be 483 BC. There's 1 year left before this great battle is to be waged against the Greeks in 484 BC. So the scene is set in the city of Susa, which served as one of the capital cities of the Persian Empire during this time. The other locations were Ecbatana, Babylon, and Persepolis. So in verse 3, we learn Ahasuerus gave a banquet for all his princes and attendants. the army officers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of his provinces being in his presence. All right. Who are these people and why are they being invited there? So we'll start with the princes would be referring to royal family or the royal family line. This probably includes the sons of Darius the First. This would include grandchildren. This might include uncles, right? Anybody that's part of the royal family would, and they were male, they would be the princes. So the royal family's there. The attendants would be those who serve the king and the royal family in a very close personal service. It was an honor to be serving the royal family. So, unlike when we hear the term servants, right? We have American history about servants and how servants have been treated, and that we need to set that aside when we use the term servants for this culture and for this time in history. When you served the royal family, it was a position of prominence. People desired this position probably more than any other job going. One of the things I'll have you think on, there's a lot of people that kind of, I don't know, they read romance novels or they'll read different stories or watch a thing on TV and they're like, oh, I wish I could have lived back when, right? And they fill in the blank and they see themselves as, I don't know, the lady in waiting in the fancy dress, coming down the stairs and sipping their wine and taking naps, right? Let me just reassure you, the number of people in the population that got that privilege was teeny, 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 tiny. So most likely, if you suddenly were to have a time travel and go back there, you'd be not there. You'd be on your knees in the garden, birthing another child, cleaning the dirt floors, right? You would be one of the people just trying to survive. That's what most people were. So that gives you a picture of why it was such, I don't know, a privilege to serve with the royals, because you got to eat their food and drink their wine and probably sleep in some pretty good accommodations. Oh, and be safe from people attacking and killing you, right? All of those things would have gone with it. So you can see it's a different word for servants and attendants. And these people also would have been there with everything that the royals were going through. So they would have probably also been the kind of people the royal could turn to and say, well, what do you think? Right? Because that person would know the family history or the background to all the situations that are going on and would be able to say, well, since we know this about Uncle Tommy, let's, right? They would have been there for that as well. Anyway, next to those listed that we just talked about with the royals were the army officials from Persia and Media. And this would clearly be talking about the military leaders of his kingdom. Finally, the nobles and the princes of his provinces were invited. So the number of the provinces of this kingdom was defined for us in verse 1 as 127 provinces. These would be those who were the current leaders of the provinces and those who were connected to those leaders as maybe successors. So it's a pretty vast list of individuals who've been invited. So since we've established that the king was intent on waging a massive battle with the Greeks, right? We're into year 3. He leaves in year 5. There's some very tenuous things that need to go on in the next couple of years. So this massive battle with the Greeks, not long after his father, Darius I, had suffered a humiliating defeat, and the specific makeup of the people that are invited, it would seem logical to assume Ahasuerus would be encouraging their collective support to be successful in whatever endeavor he wants to engage in next. Verse 4 describes one of the ways the king intends to garner their needed support as he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days. But we're told specifically for 180 days. So, throughout history, many leaders of nations have put on display their might and their wealth to encourage those to support them, as well as an effort to intimidate those who might stand in opposition. Picture modern day, oh, I don't know, North Korea, China, the Soviet Union, as they have their massive parades with scores of armed marching soldiers, lines of tanks and trucks, displaying aircraft and other hardware for military purposes. This becomes a more effective now with the invention of television, which allows these images to be seen by far larger audience than just those that are in a capital city. King Ahasuerus, not having the invention of television, brings together the leaders from the far reaches of the kingdom over 180 days or 6 months time period. So it does not make sense. This is a net. This is not me going anywhere else. This is me saying, with all of this understanding of history, it does not make sense to have this extensive list of people, including all the military leaders and all the governing leaders from all 127 provinces in Susa for the full 6 months. It is not realistic to pull everyone out of their governing responsibilities at the same time for an extended period of time. That would have left the kingdom vulnerable at what is obviously a very frail time. We got revolts going on everywhere. That makes no sense. It makes more sense that all of the individuals would have been invited to Susa for some part of the 6 months. The king's goal was to gain political and military and financial support for a large-scale military operation. He would be asking for money to support this endeavor, as well as for soldiers from each of the provinces and supplies like, oh, I don't know, ships, soldiers, food, weapons, right? All of that needs to be managed and brought together. So these are the same people that his father would have pulled support from, who have recently suffered a great loss. So he's got to go back to these people in a short period of time and say, we can do this. I'm a good leader. We have plenty. We are a wonderful kingdom together. We're great. We're glorious. We can carry it off. That's what this is. It's a hoorah, bringing them together, getting everybody to support it, and probably having discussions with the different provinces about who was going to provide what. Right? If you were a province that happened to be known for your shipbuilding, then the king would probably, or his advisors would be having conversations with you about how many ships could you get done in what period of time, and when could you have them delivered, and how would you get them across ground to get to the waters, right? All of these details have to be taken care of. In verse 5, we hear, and it says when these days were completed. So when the 6 months was done, the king gave a banquet now lasting for 7 days for all the people who were present at the citadel of Susa, from the greatest to the least, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. Okay. So at the end of the 6 months of political maneuvering, there is a week-long event held in Susa. There is a declaration made that this was for all the people who were present at the citadel of Susa. What is a citadel? And I ask that question because we don't just toss that term around in our modern language, right? So from Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia, a citadel is a core fortified area of a town or a city. It may be a castle, a fortress, or a fortified center. The term is diminutive for city and thus means little city, so called because it is a smaller part of the city in which it is in the defensive core. That's what the citadel was. It was not all of Susa. It was a section within Susa. It's the citadel of Susa. So we can ask who would have been staying at the citadel of the capital city where the king's palace was being used as his residence. Think about it. Are they all there? Are all the people we just talked about that had been there for 6 months in and out, did they all stay at the citadel? That doesn't make any sense again, right? For all the reasons we just talked about. Most likely, there are representatives from all parts of the kingdom who would spend time here. We might compare that to our modern day ambassadors, those that were left from the provinces who would represent the provinces in the king's court. Verse 5 clarifies that this invitation was from the greatest to the least. This group has already been defined as those that were present at the citadel, and it would appear each of the representatives would be invited no matter the size of the province that they represented. Think about it like our U.S. Senate. It doesn't matter what state you're from, how small in population or large in population it is, you have an equal vote. You are represented from the least to the greatest. That is what I believe we're looking at here and why that is included, from the least to the greatest. The 7-day banquet was specifically held in the court of the garden of the king's palace. In verse 6, we get visual details regarding the lavishness of this banquet, as there were hangings of fine white and violet linen held by cords of fine purple linen on silver rings and marble columns, and couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of I don't know how you say that for sure, porphyria, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Each detail given is a vision of extreme opulence. Huge linens of white drapery everywhere, not commonly found as in our day. There was no Bed Bath & Beyond or anything else to run down and grab it, right? These were massive undertakings. The purple linen was particularly highlighted here because it was displayed as a royal setting. So purple was a color that was reserved for royalty to either wear or to use, as purple was a very costly color to acquire. The sparkling gold and silver couches would have been laden with probably some very comfortable cushions, and the mosaic floors everywhere would be reflective of any of the light that would be provided. Close your eyes and just picture that. Picture the white linen blowing in the breeze and the purple that highlights it, and the gold couches with beautiful, extravagant cushions for comfort. And every floor sparkles with whatever light, like during the daylight, sunlight is going to be reflected off of it. At night, whatever artificial light of candles or lamps or whatever, it's beautiful and it's stunning. And it's to have a very particular impact. The king wants everybody to understand, I'm great, I'm wonderful, I'm meant to win this. We need to do it together. Are you with me or not? It's an encouragement, but don't forget, it comes with what? And if you're not with me, beware. It comes with both of those, right? Human nature doesn't really change all that much, does it? So the details given here would be a strong indication that the author of the book of Esther was present and was an eyewitness to the events being recorded. In verse 7, it continues to describe the lavishness that's poured out to those attending, as the drinks were served in golden vessels of various kinds, and that the royal wine was plentiful according to the king's bounty. So, the Persians were known for their artistry, and it was displayed in the creation of beautiful golden vessels, again demonstrating the splendor of the king's court. So unlike when, I don't know, when we set a table, don't we like to have all of them be all matchy-matchy, right? Matchy-matchy wasn't a thing then. That wasn't what made it special. It was that they were all unique and different. You would see, like on the wall, you don't have the same painting, right? You have a variety. This was artistry laid out on the table. There was a variety. There are some writers, because I've looked at quite a few commentaries, who have asserted that these just may be the vessels that were removed from Jerusalem by King Nebuchadnezzar. But that would not line up with the historical events, as these had been returned to Jerusalem back under King Cyrus. We see that in Ezra chapter 5, verses 13 and 14. So Ezra 5, 13 and 14. However, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, King Cyrus issued a decree to rebuild this house of God. Also, the gold and silver utensils of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem and brought them to the temple of Babylon. These King Cyrus took from the temple of Babylon, and they were given to one whose name was Shalmaneser, whom he had appointed governor. So everything that Nebuchadnezzar had taken under Cyrus, when he signed the decree, he gave back all that had been collected and had been stored in Babylon, and it was to go back to Jerusalem. That's just a side note, only because there were some people within the commentaries that went off on this. Oh, and these were the vessels and they were being used for this horror. It's like, we're not going there because we can just cut that off when we looked at the simplicity of the context. Verse 7 also indicates that the royal wine was plentiful. Basically, not your table wine, your table wine like we might have. This was to impress, and the volume was significant. So the quality and the quantity were to be excessive. Everything here is to describe an absolutely extravagant banquet. Verse 8 gives an interesting detail that the drinking was done according to the law. There was no compulsion, for so the king had given orders to each official of his household that he should do according to the desire of each person. Interesting detail. So, first, according to the law, there was not to be compulsion to drink. There are known customs of this time that compelled the guest to drink according to established traditions. Guests were often obliged to drink whenever the host drank. This would guarantee the host would not have more than the attendees. So there's logical reasons behind it, right? You wouldn't want the host having, 5 glasses and those that were there attending only having one, because then the host might look foolish and everybody else could remember it. It's much better if we're all equally smashed. That was kind of the logic going on here. Make sure that we all had the same. Again, the law was created most likely to make sure that that wasn't what was happening, and that there wouldn't be individuals forced to drink based on what somebody else's decision was at the time. The fact that the scriptures record specifically that there was no compulsion to drink would support that this was how drinking was practiced at this particular banquet versus how it was practiced at other times. So it's specifically identified for whatever reason in the scriptures because it's set aside as something unique and it needs to be noted. The scriptures say for this event, the king had given orders to each of the officials of his household that he should do according to the desires of each person. Those serving were to honor the wishes of the guests attending. Keep in mind, in this vast reaches of this kingdom and all the cultures that would have been represented here, this was done to honor each culture's tradition and not to force what may have been the norm of the king's court as a mandate. This was graciousness being open to all those that were there at the citadel of Susa. So, in these first 8 verses of Esther, we have introduced to the historical time the placement and time. So the time was about 483 BC. We've identified one of the main characters of the narrative, known historically as Ahasuerus or Xerxes, depending on what historical records you may be reading. The location of the events transpired at the citadel of Susa. With these details, we are able to understand with more clarity the remainder of the events that will follow in our study of Esther. In our contextual study of the time period, We know of the political intrigue that is happening, like the revolts and the transition of the newly appointed king, the recent history of the war against the Greeks that had been waged by Darius I. We also have the benefit of hindsight as we know what takes place a year from now and their happenings in history. This is the backdrop to give us a foundation for understanding the book of Esther in its historical context. As we continue our study of the people included in the narrative given in Esther, we will have a better understanding of the events surrounding them and the impact of their decisions and their actions. We can glean from their response to the circumstances a model for how we are to respond in our own circumstances. So this isn't a story that we read set up on a shelf. It's a story, it's a narrative that as we read, we need to glean what is being communicated in this story that's relevant for us today. The overriding theme of the book of Esther will lead us back to a beautiful picture of the sovereignty of God in history. How God uses world events to continue revealing His perfect plan for His purposes to bring Him glory. That is the beginning of the book of Esther.